Okay, we're going to pick up with the Mexican-American War, which occurred 1846 to 1848, about 15, 20 years before our Civil War. And it was, as you learned from the scavenger hunt, it was ended by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And what it was, as you learned from the video, is it was a border dispute between Texas, which was a state in the United States at the time, part of America, and Mexico. They couldn't agree over the border. One thing led to another, some shooting started, we ended up going to war. And the Americans won it relatively quickly, as you saw from the video. Probably the most important outcome of that, as a result of the treaty at the end of the war, Mexico was basically forced to sell what we now think of as the southwest part of America: California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah. I might be leaving one out. But that whole area of America, all of those states, were part of Mexico until 1848, until that treaty, at which point we forced them to sell. So a lot, it's been 180 years, but a lot of Mexicans still think of that part of the United States. They think, well, it should be part of Mexico, it's really Mexico. And they've got a name for it, El Norte, the North, El Norte. So that's when our geography, our area expands quite a bit. This was sold to us in 1848. There's a gold rush in California the next year in 1849. That's where you get the San Francisco 49ers from, fun fact. And so right after we buy it, we find gold, and it becomes an important part of America. Okay, so sort of moving ahead. We talked last time about how after Mexico won its independence, there was a long period of instability, one leader after another, one coup d'etat after another, with one leader pushing another one out, and the other one comes back. Mexico finally got some stability in 1876. A general takes over named General Diaz, D-I-A-Z. His name was Porfirio Diaz. And he is able, unlike the previous leaders, to stay in power until 1910. And so that's going to give Mexico some much needed stability. Finally, they've got one leader in charge who can stay there, who can do some things, accomplish some things. And he was the kind of leader who looked to do business with other countries. We talked about Deng Xiaoping in China. He opened up China to the rest of the world. He invited companies from other countries to come in to China to do business there. And in many ways, Diaz was very similar. He encouraged FDI, particularly from the United States. He encouraged United States fruit companies and food companies and things like that to come to Mexico and do business. As a result, the economy of Mexico got better. Some people got really rich in Mexico, though a lot of the money ended up going to the U.S. corporations. But at the same time, as we've seen a number of times this year, when you do this, you get an increasing gap between rich and poor. So the people who are able to sort of economically benefit from these foreign businesses get a lot richer, but the people who aren't stay where they are, and so that means there's a bigger gap between the two, and we've seen that as one of the sort of leading consequences of globalization. We've seen that basically all year long. So he is in power for almost 40 years. In 1910, they have what they call now the Mexican Revolution, where Diaz is overthrown. And two groups of people rise up against him. The poor rise up against him because they just see other people getting rich, they're not getting the benefits, and they're tired of being poor. But then also, some other elites join with the poor in kicking out Diaz, and because they're jealous because they want power. Diaz has been the dictator for 40 years, and they want their piece, they want their time to lead, to be in charge. So these groups come together, and overthrow Diaz in 1910 in what's called the Mexican Revolution. And so for the next 7 years, everybody agrees they want Diaz gone, but then nobody can agree on who should be next. And all these local caudillos, C-A-U-D-I-L-L-O-S, kind of like the local strongman, the person who's in charge in this part of Mexico versus that part of Mexico, and they're fighting each other for power. So in the southern part of Mexico, this guy's in charge. In the northwestern part, it's this guy. The central part is that guy, and a very weak central government. So for example, a couple of names that you might have heard of people who were sort of caudillos at the time. They sort of ran their part of Mexico. Pancho Villa. Emilio Zapata. So the local sort of strongmen are fighting each other for power. And in 1917, which if you remember is the same year that the Soviet Union began, Mexico writes a constitution that they still use today, that they still live under today. And basically, these caudillos got together and said, why are we fighting each other? Let's set up something that's fair to everybody. And so in this constitution, you've got, first of all, a democracy. And as we saw in the study guide, you've got branches of government and elections and presidents and things like that. The church is restricted. So it cut back on the rights of the Catholic Church to try to keep them out of government. So maybe a better way to put it is something we're familiar with, the idea of separation of church and state is put into the Mexican Constitution. Even though the Catholic Church is overwhelmingly popular there, this keeps them separate from government, church and government separate. They also put something in there that said everything under the ground in Mexico belongs to the government. So if you've got oil in your backyard, it belongs to the government, not you. That's not how we do things in America. About 15 years ago, some huge oil deposits were found in North Dakota. And literally the people on this street became millionaires overnight because there was oil in their backyard, and 2 streets over there wasn't, and those people kept living the same lives. That wouldn't happen in Mexico. It doesn't matter whose land the oil is on, it belongs to the government. That's going to be a big deal later, so we'll come back to that. And then the last thing they did is if you remember under Diaz, a lot of these elites were a little jealous because Diaz had been in power for 40 years and they didn't get their piece of the pie. So they set up in the Constitution a provision, we're going to have a president just like America. That president will be elected just like America, but the president can only serve 1 6-year term. And then he's out and he can't come back. And they did this so that the elites could all have sort of their share of power. It was avoiding another Diaz. It was a way for people like Zapata or Pancho Villa or whoever was around by 1917 to say, okay, you can do this for 6 years, but then I'm going to get my term, then he's going to get his term. And that's still what they have today. The Mexican president can serve for 6 years, but then he's out and someone else has to come in. So we're going to stop there for now.